"I'll never marry you," the millionaire declared. But 7 years later, he saw her in the hospital and felt crushed by regret. "God bless you, my beautiful family." Because of a long introduction, 90% of viewers leave the story early, and YouTube has destroyed my channel. I am in tears. Now let us begin the most powerful and heart-touching story, written with love. Some love stories begin with a glance across a crowded room, but theirs began with blood on her hands and tears in his eyes. Kessie Amara Monroe was 25 and exhausted, her nursing student uniform wrinkled from another 16-hour shift at City Hope Hospital. She'd been running on coffee and determination for weeks, juggling clinical rotations with her part-time job in the children's ward. The fluorescent lights made everyone look pale and tired, but somehow they only made her dark skin glow warmer, her compassionate brown eyes more luminous. She was cleaning blood from a car accident victim's forehead when she first heard his voice, low, measured, carrying the weight of money and authority that she'd learned to recognize in her years of caring for the wealthy patients who occasionally graced their charity ward. "Is he going to be okay?" Kessie looked up to find a man standing in the doorway of Trauma Bay 3, his expensive suit incongruous among the medical chaos. Albert Thaddeus Bradford was 32, though his storm-grey eyes held decades more weariness. His dark hair was perfectly styled, despite the late hour, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass, but what caught her attention was the genuine concern etched across his aristocratic features. "Are you family?" she asked, not pausing in her gentle ministrations to the unconscious teenager on the gurney. "No, Albert hesitated, watching her hands move with practiced precision. "I was driving behind them when it happened. I called the ambulance." Something in his voice, vulnerability beneath the polish, made Kessie look at him again. Really look, past the $1,000 watch and tailored jacket to the man who'd stayed at the hospital for hours, waiting to know if a stranger would survive. "He's going to be fine," she said softly. "Teenagers heal fast. He'll have a scar, but he'll have stories to go with it." Albert's shoulders sagged with relief, and for the first time that night, he smiled. It transformed his entire face, erasing the harsh lines of wealth and responsibility, revealing someone younger, more human. "Thank you," he said, "for taking care of him, for caring." Their eyes met across the sterile room, and something shifted in the air between them. Not attraction, not yet, but recognition. Two souls acknowledging something rare and worth protecting. That should have been the end of it. A wealthy philanthropist and a nursing student from the south side of the city, their worlds as different as silk and cotton. But Albert Bradford had built an empire by recognizing value where others saw none, and in Kessie Monroe he recognized something priceless. He began showing up at the hospital during her shifts. Not obviously. Albert Bradford didn't chase women. He simply found reasons to be there, checking on his charitable donations, visiting the children's wing he'd funded, consulting with department heads about expansion plans, always professional, always appropriate, but somehow he was always there when Kessie's shift ended at 11 o'clock. "You don't have to wait for me," she told him one rainy Thursday night, finding him reading in the lobby for the third time that week. "I'm not waiting," he lied smoothly. "I'm reading. The hospital has excellent lighting for literary appreciation." She laughed, a sound like warm honey that made something tight in his chest loosen. "At 11 p.m., in a hospital lobby. What exactly are you reading that requires such dedication?" He held up his book, and she burst into laughter again. "Strategic Management in Non-Profit Organizations. Albert, that's literally the most boring book ever written." "I'll have you know this is riveting material," he protested, but his mouth was twitching with suppressed mirth. Chapter 7 discusses optimal resource allocation in clinical settings. Edge-of-your-seat stuff. "You're ridiculous," she said, shaking her head. But she was smiling, and when he offered to walk her to her car, She didn't refuse. Their first real conversation happened during that walk across the parking lot. She told him about nursing school, about her dream of becoming a pediatric nurse, about the way children's faces lit up when someone truly listened to them. He found himself talking about loneliness, how success had built walls around him that felt impossible to scale, how he'd stopped believing in connections that weren't based on what he could provide. "Everyone wants something," he said, surprising himself with his honesty. "I don't," Kessie replied simply. "I don't even know what you could give me that I don't already have." It was true. She had purpose, passion, dreams that belonged entirely to her. She looked at him not as Albert Bradford, billionaire philanthropist, but as Albert, a man who stayed up too late worrying about strangers, who read boring books in hospital lobbies just to catch glimpses of something real. Their courtship unfolded in stolen moments between her classes and his board meetings, late-night drives through the city in his understated sedan, not the flashy cars the tabloids photographed him with, but the quiet luxury he preferred when cameras weren't watching. He showed her the rooftop garden of his building, where he'd built something beautiful just for the joy of watching things grow. "I never expected this," he admitted one night, standing behind her as she looked out over the twinkling city lights. "What?" she asked, leaning back against his chest. "Peace," he whispered, his arms circling her waist. "I never expected to find peace." She turned in his arms, studying his face in the moonlight. "Maybe you weren't looking in the right places." When he kissed her, it wasn't desperate or demanding. It was reverent, grateful, the kiss of a man who'd found something he'd stopped believing existed. And when she kissed him back, her hands framing his face with the same gentleness she used to comfort her patients, Albert Bradford understood what people meant when they talked about coming home. Their love existed in a bubble those first 6 months. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, her childhood dreams, his complicated relationship with his father, the books that shaped them, the music that moved them. He learned that she hummed old spirituals while she worked, that she cried during commercials with sick children, that she saved every thank you card from patients' families. She discovered that he played piano when he was stressed, that he'd memorized poetry in college and still recited it when he couldn't sleep, that beneath all his success was a little boy who'd never felt quite good enough for his father's approval. They were careful not to be seen together publicly, not because Albert was ashamed, never that, but because they both understood the precious fragility of what they were building, the media attention, the speculation, the pressure from his family and board of directors. All of that could come later, when their foundation was strong enough to weather any storm. For now, they existed in secret moments. Her head on his shoulder as they watched old movies in his private screening room. His hand finding hers during long walks through the botanical gardens he'd rented after hours just so they could be alone together. The way he whispered her name, Kessie, like it was a prayer, a promise, a benediction. "I love you," she told him one evening as they sat on his balcony, her legs curled beneath her, his jacket draped over her shoulders against the October chill. "I love you too," he replied without hesitation, and meant it more than he'd ever meant anything in his life. She believed him. How could she not, when he looked at her like she'd hung the stars, when he remembered every story she told, every dream she shared, when he held her like she was made of starlight and possibility? They made love that night with the city spread out below them, slow and tender and full of whispered promises about the future they would build together. Afterward, as she slept curled against his side, Albert traced patterns on her bare shoulder and allowed himself to imagine forever. If he'd known that within 2 months his own words would shatter everything beautiful they'd created, he would have held her tighter, would have memorized the weight of her hand in his, the sound of her breathing, the way she looked at him like he was worthy of being loved. But Albert Bradford had built his fortune on calculated risks, not on faith. And when the biggest risk of his life presented itself, he would choose fear over love, pride over vulnerability. Some mistakes once made echo through eternity. But that night, wrapped in each other's arms with the future stretching bright and boundless before them, they were invincible. They were everything. Chapter 2. The night everything changed. The silence in Albert's study was so complete that Kessie could hear her own heart breaking, piece by devastating piece. She'd been carrying the secret for 3 days, her hands unconsciously drifting to her still flat stomach during quiet moments at the hospital. 3 positive pregnancy tests hidden in her purse, their pink lines as undeniable as they were terrifying. 3 days of watching Albert across candlelit dinners, wondering how to tell the man she loved that their careful, private world was about to expand in the most beautiful, complicated way possible. The November rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse study, where awards and accolades lined mahogany shelves like trophies of a life lived in pursuit of excellence. Albert sat behind his massive oak desk, reading quarterly reports with the focused intensity that had made him a billionaire before 40. His reading glasses perched on his nose, dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that still made her stomach flutter. She'd practiced the words during her shift that evening, rehearsing different approaches while checking on patients and updating charts, casual and light. So, funny story. Direct and honest. Albert, I need to tell you something important. Romantic and dreamy. What would you think about expanding our family, but sitting in the leather chair across from his desk, watching him frown at profit margins and market projections, all her carefully planned speeches crumbled into dust. Albert. Her voice came out smaller than intended. He didn't look up from the papers, pen scratching notes in the margins with mechanical precision. I need to talk to you about something. Something in her tone made him glance up, and she saw the exact moment concern flickered across his features. He set down his pen and removed his glasses, giving her his full attention in that way that had first made her fall for him, as if she were the only person in the world worth listening to. "What's wrong?" he asked, and the gentleness in his voice almost broke her resolve. This was the Albert she knew, the man who stayed late at hospitals to check on accident victims, who remembered the names of every nurse who'd ever helped one of his charity cases, who held her like she was precious. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything beautiful they'd built. She watched his face change, saw the exact moment those 2 words registered in his brilliant mind, and began calculating implications, consequences, complications. His eyes went still, not cold, not yet, but frighteningly blank, as if some essential part of him had simply stopped functioning. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, growing wider with each passing second. "How?" The word came out flat, clinical. "The usual way, I imagine," she said, attempting lightness that fell dead in the heavy air. "Albert, say something else, please." But he was already standing, moving to the window with the restless energy of a caged predator. She watched him run both hands through his hair, a gesture she'd learned meant he was calculating, weighing options, preparing for damage control. How far along? Still clinical, still cold. About 10 weeks. She stood too, wrapping her arms around herself against a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. "Albert, talk to me. Tell me what you're thinking." He spun to face her, and she saw a stranger looking back with Albert's eyes. The warmth, the tenderness, the love she'd grown to depend on, all of it had vanished, replaced by something harder, more calculating. "What I'm thinking." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm thinking about board meetings and shareholders and media scrutiny. I'm thinking about scandal and damage control and how this complicates absolutely everything." Each word hit her like a physical blow. Complicates. "Albert, this is our baby, our child." Our mistake, he corrected, and she actually stumbled backward as if he'd slapped her. Mistake? Her voice broke on the word. Is that what you think this is? What we are? He began pacing, the way he did when wrestling with hostile takeovers or difficult mergers. Except she wasn't a business problem to be solved. She was the woman he'd whispered love songs to just last week, who'd fallen asleep in his arms a dozen times, who'd given him her heart so completely she'd forgotten to keep any pieces for herself. We never discussed children, he said, still pacing. Never talked about making this permanent. Making what permanent? Our relationship? Because you thought wrong. The cruelty in his voice stopped her mid-sentence. This wasn't the man who brought her coffee during her study sessions, who'd learned her favorite flowers and surprised her with quiet evenings reading poetry aloud. This was someone else entirely, someone whose love apparently came with conditions she'd never known existed. Albert, please, you're scaring me. I'm being realistic, he snapped. Do you understand what this would mean? The complications, my family, the board, the media. What about us? She interrupted, desperate now. What about what this means for us? There is no us, not like this, not with a baby. The words hung in the air like toxic fumes, poisoning everything they'd built together. Cassie felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like a door slamming shut on every dream she'd nurtured about their future. So what are you saying? Her voice was steady now, dangerously quiet. Albert stopped pacing and straightened his cuffs, a gesture she'd seen him make before business meetings, before difficult conversations, before moments when he needed to armor himself against the world. Her heart shattered as she realized he was armoring himself against her. I'm saying this doesn't have to change anything, he said. And the careful neutrality in his tone was worse than anger would have been. We can handle this quietly, discreetly. I know people who... Stop. The word came out like a whip crack, sharp enough to cut through his calculated composure. Just stop talking. She stared at him across the study that had felt like sanctuary just minutes before, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not the romantic hero she'd created in her mind, but a man who loved his reputation more than he could ever love her. A man who saw their child, their miracle, as a problem to be managed. You want me to get rid of our baby, she said, not a question, but a statement that tasted like ashes in her mouth. I want us to be smart about this, he replied, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. Smart. She nodded slowly, understanding flooding through her like ice water. Smart would have been realizing who you really were before I fell in love with you. Cassie, don't be dramatic. Dramatic? She laughed, but it sounded broken even to her own ears. Albert, I'm carrying your child, and you just suggested I get rid of it to protect your business interests. If that's not worth drama, what is? He moved toward her then, hands outstretched as if to comfort, but she stepped back. The gesture hurt him. She could see it in his eyes, but she couldn't bear his touch when it came wrapped in conditions and compromises. You have to understand my position, he said, and she heard desperation creeping into his voice. The timing is impossible. The board is already questioning some of my decisions, and if they find out about this, about me, she corrected. You can't even say it, can you? If they find out about me. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? She moved to the door, needing distance, needing air. Tell me something, Albert. When you imagined your future, your real future, was I in it? The hesitation was answer enough. A pause that lasted maybe 2 seconds, but felt like an eternity, revealing every truth he'd been hiding from both of them. I thought so, she whispered. Cassie, wait. But she was already opening the door, dignity wrapping around her like armor, even as her heart bled out across his expensive Persian rugs. I'll never marry you, Cassie, he called after her, the words spoken like a weapon designed to wound. Don't mistake what we had for forever. She froze in the doorway, her back to him, gathering the shattered pieces of her dreams and her pride. When she turned around, her voice was steady as stone, carrying the weight of every lesson her mother had ever taught her about self-respect. "No, Albert, you just mistook my love for convenience." She walked out of his study, out of his penthouse, out of his life. The elevator doors closed on the sound of him calling her name, but she didn't look back. Some bridges, once burned, were never meant to be rebuilt. Outside, the November rain had turned to sleet, stinging her face as she walked to her car. But the cold couldn't touch the ice that had formed around her heart, protective and numbing and absolute. She drove home through empty streets, one hand unconsciously protective over her belly, already loving the tiny life growing there more than she'd ever loved the man who'd rejected them both. Some mistakes echo through eternity, but some choices, however painful, save us from settling for less than we deserve. Albert Bradford had just made the greatest mistake of his life, and Kessie Amara Monroe was about to discover exactly how strong she really was. Chapter 3. 7 Years of Silence. The morning Kessie Amara Monroe became a mother of 2, she understood that heartbreak was just another word for transformation. 7 years had passed since that November night when her world shattered in Albert Bradford's study. 7 years of choosing strength over bitterness, hope over hurt, love over the echoing silence of what might have been. Now 32, she stood in the bathroom mirror of their modest 3-bedroom apartment, braiding cornrows into Elijah Zion's thick hair while Isaiah River waited his turn, both boys chattering about their science project on butterfly metamorphosis. "Mama, did you know some butterflies migrate thousands of miles?" Elijah asked, his storm-grey eyes bright with curiosity that reminded her, painfully, of someone else's intellectual passion. "They follow patterns they've never seen before," Isaiah added, bouncing on his toes with barely contained energy. "But somehow they always know where to go." "Just like us," Kessie murmured, securing the last braid with practiced efficiency. "We follow our hearts and trust them to lead us home." The boys were 7 now, tall for their age, with the kind of striking features that made strangers do double takes on the street. Albert's aristocratic bone structure softened by her gentler curves, his piercing grey eyes warmed by her compassionate nature, his sharp intelligence tempered by her emotional wisdom. They were beautiful children who had never known they were missing anything because Kessie had filled every space where a father should have been with twice the love. "Breakfast in 5 minutes," she called, heading to the kitchen where their grandmother Amina was already packing lunch boxes with the precision of a woman who'd raised 3 children on her own. "Those boys get more like you every day," Amina observed, her voice carrying the warm cadence of Georgia peach orchards and Sunday morning church bells. At 68, she remained elegant and formidable, silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Asking questions about everything, wanting to understand how the world works. "Good," Kessie replied, checking the contents of their backpacks. "Questions mean they're not afraid to challenge what doesn't make sense." It was a lesson she'd learned the hard way. For 2 years after walking out of Albert's penthouse, she'd questioned everything. Her judgment, her worth, whether love was just another fairy tale designed to make women settle for less than they deserved. Pregnancy had been difficult without medical insurance, worked multiple jobs while her belly grew, studied for final exams while dealing with morning sickness that lasted all day. Dr. Imani Celeste Washington, her best friend from nursing school, had been her anchor during those dark months. "You're not broken," Imani would remind her during their late-night study sessions. "You're just learning how to fly with wings you didn't know you had." The night the twins were born, 2 months early, small and fragile and absolutely perfect, Kessie had held them in the NICU and whispered promises that would shape the next 7 years of their lives. "You will never doubt that you're loved. You will never settle for less than you deserve. You will never define your worth by someone else's ability to see it. She'd kept every promise. The apartment they called home was small, but filled with love's evidence. Artwork from every stage of the boys' development covered the refrigerator and hallway walls. Photos documented every milestone: first steps, lost teeth, school plays, birthday parties. Their modest furniture was well chosen and cared for, everything arranged to create maximum comfort and beauty within their means. "Mama, Mrs. Zuri made us cookies again," Isaiah announced, returning from their neighbor's apartment with a plate of still-warm chocolate chip cookies and a broad grin. Zuri Essence Johnson was 73, a retired teacher who'd adopted their small family the day they moved in. She watched the boys after school when Kessie worked late shifts, helped with homework when math got complicated, and provided the kind of unconditional love that made their chosen family complete. "That woman is going to spoil you both," Kessie said, but she was smiling as she wrapped the cookies for their lunchboxes. "She says spoiling is just love with extra sugar," Elijah replied solemnly, and both women laughed at his serious delivery. This was their morning rhythm, perfected over 7 years of single parenthood. Breakfast eaten together while discussing the day ahead, backpacks checked and rechecked, hugs and kisses dispensed with the same care other families might reserve for special occasions. Every morning was special when you'd built your life on intentional love. "Have a beautiful day, baby boys," Kessie called as they headed for the school bus, watching from the window until they were safely aboard. Her own day began with the drive to City Hope Hospital, where she'd worked as a pediatric nurse for the past 4 years. The irony of returning to the place where she'd met Albert wasn't lost on her, but the children's ward had become her sanctuary. Here, she was Nurse Monroe, the one who sang lullabies during painful procedures, who remembered every child's favorite color, who had a gift for making even the sickest kids smile. "Room 314 is asking for you specifically," her colleague Nurse Patricia mentioned during their morning briefing. "Little Maria refuses to take her medication from anyone else." Kessie nodded, already mentally preparing the silly song she'd created to help 6-year-old Maria remember to take her heart medication. This was her gift, the ability to meet children where they were, to speak their language, to make healing feel less frightening. Working with sick children had taught her that love wasn't just an emotion, but an action, repeated daily in small gestures that accumulated into something transformative. The same way she'd built a life for her sons, not through grand gestures or expensive gifts, but through consistent presence, unwavering support, and the kind of love that didn't come with conditions. During her lunch break, she studied for the nurse practitioner program she'd finally started the previous fall. Evening classes 3 nights a week, online coursework when the boys were sleeping, clinical rotations that exhausted her but filled her with purpose. At 32, she was finally pursuing the dream that pregnancy had interrupted, but now it felt more meaningful because she was doing it for all 3 of them. "Mama's going to be a nurse practitioner," Isaiah had announced proudly to his class during career day, beaming as if she'd declared her intention to become president. "What's the difference?" one child had asked. "She'll be able to help even more people," Elijah had answered with quiet pride. "That's what she does. She helps people feel better." The afternoon brought its usual challenges. A toddler with pneumonia whose parents were terrified, twins born prematurely who reminded her of her own boy's early struggles, a teenager with diabetes who was angry at the world and taking it out on everyone trying to help her. Kessie met each situation with the same combination of professional competence and emotional intelligence that had made her one of the ward's most requested nurses. She'd learned to compartmentalize her own struggles, to show up fully for other people's children while carrying the weight of raising her own alone. Evening meant homework supervision at their small kitchen table, where the boys worked on math problems while she prepared dinner. This was sacred time. No television, no distractions, just focused attention on whatever they needed to understand. "I don't get fractions," Isaiah complained. erasing his work for the third time. "Think of it like sharing cookies," Kessie suggested, sliding a plate between them. "If you have 4 cookies and want to share them equally with your brother, how many would each of you get?" 2, both boys chorused. "Right, so 4 divided by 2 equals 2. Or you could say each of you gets 2/4 of the original 4 cookies." Understanding dawned on Isaiah's face like sunrise. This was how she'd learned to translate complex concepts into language they could grasp, by connecting abstract ideas to their lived experience, by making learning feel like discovery rather than drudgery. Bedtime was her favorite part of each day. After baths and toothbrushing and the ritual searching for missing stuffed animals, she'd sit between their beds and read stories that transported them to worlds where anything was possible. Sometimes they'd request the same book night after night until she could recite it from memory. Other times they wanted new adventures, new heroes, new dreams to carry into sleep. "Mama," Elijah said one night as she finished reading about a little boy who befriended dragons, "do you think our daddy is somewhere missing us?" The question hit like a physical blow, stealing her breath for a moment. 7 years, and they still asked occasionally, their curiosity natural and innocent and devastating. "I think," she said carefully, "that some people aren't ready to be parents when they need to be, and sometimes the best gift they can give is stepping back so their children can be raised by people who are ready." "Like you," Isaiah said, snuggling deeper under his covers. "Like me," she confirmed, kissing both their foreheads. "And Grandma Amina and Mrs. Zuri and all the people who love you exactly as you are." Later, after they'd fallen asleep, she'd sit on her small balcony with a cup of tea and allow herself to feel the weight of raising 2 brilliant, sensitive boys alone, the exhaustion that never quite left her bones, the loneliness that crept in during quiet moments, the fear that she wasn't enough, couldn't provide everything they needed, might somehow fail them despite her best efforts. But mostly, she felt pride. Pride in the young men her sons were becoming. Pride in the life she'd built from the ashes of broken dreams. Pride in choosing love over bitterness, hope over despair, strength over the easy comfort of victimhood. Some nights, she'd wonder what Albert Bradford was doing in his glass tower across the city, whether he ever thought about the choice he'd made, the family he'd rejected, the love he'd thrown away to protect a reputation that would outlive him but wouldn't love him back. But those thoughts grew rarer with each passing year, replaced by gratitude for the life she'd chosen instead. A life that was smaller than what she'd once imagined, but infinitely richer than what she'd feared. 7 years of silence had taught her that the greatest love stories aren't always the ones that end in marriage. Sometimes they're the ones that begin with a woman discovering she's strong enough to love without conditions, brave enough to build dreams from scratch, and wise enough to know that being chosen by the right person is less important than choosing yourself. In her modest apartment filled with laughter and homework and bedtime stories, Kessie Amara Monroe had created something more valuable than all of Albert Bradford's wealth. A home built on unconditional love, where 2 little boys learned daily that they were worthy of everything good the world had to offer. Some transformations happen overnight. Others take 7 years of choosing love, one day at a time. Chapter 4. When Worlds Collide Again. Some nights steal your breath and change the trajectory of every day that follows, and this Tuesday in March would be one that haunted Kessie Monroe's dreams for years to come. It started with Isaiah's scream echoing through their apartment at 2:17 a.m., a sound of pure terror that launched her from sleep into the kind of maternal panic that turns seconds into lifetimes. She found him standing over Elijah's bed, tears streaming down his face as his twin brother burned with fever that seemed to radiate from his small body like heat from a furnace. "He won't wake up, Mama," Isaiah sobbed, his 7-year-old voice breaking on words too heavy for a child to carry. "I tried shaking him, but he won't wake up." Kessie's nursing training kicked in, even as her mother's heart shattered. Elijah's temperature was 104.3 degrees and climbing, his breathing shallow and rapid, his usually vibrant grey eyes rolling back beneath fluttering eyelids, febrile seizure territory. Every pediatric nurse's nightmare when it was your own child burning up in your arms. "Call Grandma Amina," she instructed Isaiah, while wrapping Elijah in a light blanket, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "Tell her to meet us at City Hope Hospital. Can you do that for me, baby?" Isaiah nodded, wiping his tears with the back of his hand and reaching for the phone with shaking fingers. At 7 years old, he'd learned to be brave when his brother needed him, a lesson that broke Kessie's heart, even as she relied on his strength. The drive to City Hope Hospital was a blur of red traffic lights that felt like eternal obstacles and radio static that couldn't drown out Elijah's labored breathing in the back seat. Isaiah held his twin's hand, whispering stories about their favorite cartoon characters and promising that everything would be okay, displaying the kind of courage that reminded Kessie why she fought so hard to give them everything they needed. "Stay with me, Elijah," she murmured, checking his temperature again at the last red light, still climbing. "You're going to be fine, baby. Mama's going to make sure you're fine." City Hope Children's Hospital at 3 in the morning was a symphony of controlled chaos. Fluorescent lights that turned everyone's skin sallow, the constant beeping of monitors, the soft-soled footsteps of night shift nurses moving with practiced efficiency through corridors that held equal measures of hope and heartbreak. Dr. Kamaria Hope Sterling, the boys' pediatrician, met them at the emergency entrance despite the ungodly hour. She was a woman in her mid-40s with gentle hands and kind eyes who'd been treating the twins since they were tiny babies fighting to survive in the NICU. "How long has he been like this?" she asked, already examining Elijah as orderlies transferred him to a pediatric gurney. "Temperature spiked about an hour ago," Kessie reported, falling into professional mode even as her personal world tilted off its axis. No other symptoms yesterday. He was fine at dinner, normal bedtime routine. They wheeled Elijah into pediatric trauma bay 7, where the familiar chaos of emergency medicine unfolded around her son. IV lines, blood draws, chest x-rays, all the interventions she'd performed on hundreds of other children but had never imagined needing for her own. Isaiah sat in the family consultation room with Amina, who'd arrived within 20 minutes of his phone call, her grey hair still in rollers, but her presence steady as granite. Kessie paced the corridor outside Trauma Bay 7, her nursing scrubs from the previous day's shift wrinkled, and her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. This was her workplace, her second home, the pediatric ward where she'd comforted hundreds of terrified parents. But standing on the other side of the glass, watching her son fight a fever that refused to break, she understood for the first time the particular agony of loving someone more than your own life and being powerless to fix what was broken. "The antibiotics are starting to work," Dr. Sterling assured her during her third update in 2 hours. "His white count suggests bacterial infection, probably strep that went systemic. We caught it early enough." Kessie nodded, her medical training allowing her to understand the implications, while her mother's heart simply focused on the rise and fall of Elijah's chest, the gradual cooling of his skin, the way his eyes finally fluttered open around 6 a.m. and focused on her face with recognition and relief. "Mama?" His voice was hoarse but beautifully, wonderfully present. "I'm here, baby," she whispered, taking his small hand in both of hers. "You're going to be fine. Everything's going to be fine." By 8 a.m., Elijah was stable enough to move to a regular pediatric room, his fever broken and his vital signs returning to normal ranges. Isaiah had fallen asleep curled in the chair beside his brother's bed, refusing to leave, despite Amina's gentle suggestions that he needed rest too. "They've never been separated for a single night," Kessie explained to Dr. Sterling. Twin telepathy, my mother calls it. Isaiah always knows when Elijah needs him. It was this scene, her exhausted 7-year-old son maintaining vigil over his twin brother. Both boys testament to the unbreakable bonds she'd nurtured through 7 years of intentional love that she was watching through the hospital room window when her entire world shifted on its axis once again. She felt him before she saw him, some primitive instinct that recognized his presence the way migrating birds recognize magnetic north, unavoidable and unchangeable. The same sensation that had stopped her breath 7 years ago when he'd walked into Trauma Bay 3 asking about a stranger's welfare. Albert Thaddeus Bradford stood 20 feet away in the main corridor, surrounded by the usual entourage that accompanied wealthy philanthropists on hospital visits. His hair was grayer at the temples now, his expensive suit perfectly tailored to a frame that was still imposing, but somehow less intimidating than she remembered. He was listening to Dr. Patricia Henderson, the hospital administrator, discuss expansion plans for the new children's cardiac wing he was funding. He looked like what he'd always been, money and power and calculated generosity designed to enhance a carefully curated public image. But something was different too, tired maybe. The lines around his eyes deeper, his shoulders carrying a weight that hadn't been there 7 years ago. Kessie stood frozen in the corridor, hoping he wouldn't notice her, praying he would simply conclude his business and disappear back into the rarefied world she'd never truly belonged to. But hope had always been a fragile thing where Albert Bradford was concerned. He turned, scanning the corridor with the unconscious authority of a man accustomed to surveying his domain, and their eyes met across 30 feet of hospital linoleum. Time stopped. 7 years collapsed into nothing. Every carefully built wall around her heart trembled at the recognition in his storm-grey eyes. He blinked once, twice, as if she might be a mirage conjured by guilt or wishful thinking. But she remained solid, real, wearing scrubs that marked her as staff rather than visitor, her natural hair pulled back in the same practical style she'd favored during nursing school. Then his gaze shifted beyond her to the hospital room window, where Elijah lay small and pale against white sheets, while Isaiah maintained his protective vigil from the bedside chair. Albert's face went through a series of expressions too rapid to catalogue: confusion, recognition, and finally a dawning horror that would have been satisfying if it hadn't been so devastating to witness. She watched him process what he was seeing, the grey eyes that mirrored his own, the stubborn set of their jaws, the way Isaiah held his brother's hand with fierce protectiveness that echoed Albert's own childhood memories of guarding his sister Nalani from their father's criticism. These weren't just any children in a hospital room. These were his children, the ones he'd rejected before they drew their first breath, the family he'd discarded to protect his reputation. Kessie. Her name escaped his lips like a prayer or a confession, audible even across the distance separating them. The sound of his voice saying her name, still with that same reverent tone that had once made her believe in forever, nearly broke her carefully maintained composure. But 7 years of single motherhood had taught her that some luxuries, like breaking down, were reserved for private moments when small boys weren't depending on your strength. She straightened her shoulders and walked toward him, not because she wanted to, but because avoiding him would give him power over her that she'd reclaimed long ago. Her colleagues in the corridor, Dr. Henderson, the nursing supervisor, the various administrators, watched with curious interest as the hospital's most generous benefactor greeted one of their most beloved pediatric nurses. "Mr. Bradford," she said when she reached them, her voice professionally pleasant but cool enough to frost glass. "I didn't realize you were visiting today." "The new cardiac wing," he managed, his usual smooth articulation absent. His eyes kept drifting past her to the hospital room window. I'm discussing final details for the dedication ceremony." "How wonderful," she replied, infusing the words with exactly the right amount of polite disinterest. The children will benefit tremendously from your generosity. The formal words hung between them like a shield, protecting her from the memories that threatened to overwhelm her professional demeanor. This was how it had to be. Pleasant, distant, absolutely nothing to suggest that this man had once held her heart in his hands and crushed it without hesitation. "Are they?" he started to ask, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. She cut him off with surgical precision, her mother's instincts overriding any courtesy she might have shown to a hospital benefactor. "You don't get to finish that sentence." The words carried 7 years of accumulated strength, delivered with the quiet authority of a woman who'd learned that some boundaries were non-negotiable. Dr. Henderson and the other administrators exchanged glances, clearly sensing undercurrents they couldn't interpret but were too polite to question. Albert's face went pale, but he nodded slightly, understanding that whatever rights he might have claimed 7 years ago had been forfeited the night he chose fear over love. "I should check on my patient," Kessie said, turning away from him and toward the room where her sons waited. "Gentlemen, I hope your meeting is productive." She walked away without looking back, her hands steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. Behind her, she could hear Dr. Henderson resuming the conversation about cardiac equipment and dedication ceremonies, but Albert's voice was notably absent from the discussion. Inside the hospital room, Isaiah was awake and watching her approach with the perceptive intelligence that sometimes made her forget he was only 7 years old. "Who was that man, Mama?" he asked quietly. "The one who was staring at us?" Kessie settled into the chair beside Elijah's bed, taking her sleeping son's hand and drawing strength from his steady breathing. "Just someone I used to know," she said, which was both completely true and entirely inadequate. "How's your brother feeling?" "Better," Isaiah replied, but his grey eyes, so achingly familiar, remained thoughtful. He looked sad, that man, like he lost something important. Children saw truth with frightening clarity sometimes. Kessie kissed Isaiah's forehead, breathing in the scent of his hair and reminding herself that some losses were choices, and some choices echoed through generations. "Some people spend their whole lives looking for things they threw away," she said gently. "But we don't worry about other people's regrets, baby boy. We focus on taking care of each other." Outside in the corridor, she could hear the meeting concluding, voices fading as Albert Bradford and his entourage moved toward the elevators. Soon he would be gone, return to his world of boardrooms and charity galas and carefully managed public appearances. But the look in his eyes when he'd seen his sons, the devastation, the recognition, the dawning understanding of what he'd lost, that would stay with her. Not because she felt sorry for him, but because, after 7 years of wondering if he ever thought about the choice he'd made, she finally had her answer. Albert Bradford knew exactly what he'd thrown away, and, unlike 7 years ago, this time she was strong enough to let him live with the consequences. Some collisions destroy everything in their path. Others simply reveal what was already broken, giving the survivors permission to keep building something better from the pieces that remain whole. Chapter 5. First Rejection, the Hospital Corridor. The fluorescent lights of City Hope Hospital cast everything in harsh, unforgiving shadows, but none more brutal than the one stretching between Albert Bradford and the life he'd abandoned 7 years ago. It was nearly 11 p.m. when Kessie finally emerged from Elijah's room, her nursing shift having officially ended hours ago but her mother's vigil continuing without regard for hospital schedules. Elijah was sleeping peacefully now, his fever completely broken, while Isaiah dozed in the chair beside his bed with the stubborn determination of a child who'd appointed himself guardian of his twins' recovery. She'd sent Amina home around 9, assuring her mother that the crisis had passed and promising to call if anything changed. Now the pediatric ward had settled into its nighttime quiet, the soft beeping of monitors, distant conversations at the nurse's station, the gentle hum of machines that kept vigil over sleeping children. Kessie walked toward the vending machines near the family consultation area, craving coffee and the few minutes of solitude needed to process the emotional earthquake of seeing Albert again. 7 years of careful emotional architecture had trembled at the recognition in his eyes, at the way he'd looked at their sons with the devastating comprehension of a man finally understanding the magnitude of his choices. She was fumbling for change in her scrub pocket when she sensed his presence behind her, that same magnetic awareness that had drawn her to him across a crowded trauma bay all those years ago. Some connections, she'd learned, were too deep to be severed by time or hurt or the practical necessities of moving forward alone. Kessie. Her name on his lips still carried that reverent quality that had once made her believe in fairy tales. She turned slowly, taking in the man who'd haunted her dreams and shaped her nightmares in equal measure. Albert looked older, wearier, the confident arrogance she remembered tempered by something that might have been regret. "Albert," her voice was steady, professional. "I thought you'd left hours ago." "I tried to." He ran both hands through his graying hair, a gesture she remembered from their intimate moments when he'd struggled to articulate feelings that didn't fit neatly into his ordered world. "I've been sitting in my car in the parking garage for 3 hours, trying to convince myself to drive away. And yet, here you are. Here I am." He moved closer, but carefully, like approaching a wounded animal that might flee. "How is he?" "Elijah." The fact that he knew his son's name shouldn't have surprised her. Albert Bradford built empires by gathering information, but it still felt like a violation somehow. These were her children, her babies, raised in love he'd rejected and strength he'd never witnessed. "He's fine," she said curtly. "Children recover quickly from things that don't kill them." The barb hit its mark. She could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, the brief flash of pain that crossed his aristocratic features. But 7 years of single motherhood had taught her that sometimes kindness was a luxury she couldn't afford, especially when it came to protecting her sons from disappointment. "Kessie, He stopped, started again. "I know I don't have the right to ask you anything. I know I forfeited any claims I might have had 7 years ago, but please, can we talk? We are talking. Really talk. About them. About us. About what happens now." She almost laughed at the presumption that there could be an us after all these years, but the sound died in her throat when she saw the naked desperation in his eyes. This wasn't the calculated billionaire philanthropist she'd seen earlier surrounded by hospital administrators. This was a man coming apart at the seams, held together only by the thin hope that maybe, somehow, forgiveness was possible. "There is no us, Albert," she said quietly. "There's me, and there are my sons, and there's the life we've built without you. That's all." "Our sons," he corrected, and she felt something dangerous flare in her chest. Not love, but the protective fury of a mother whose children had been claimed by someone who'd never earned the right. "No." The word came out like a blade, sharp enough to cut through his careful composure. "They became mine the night you told me to get rid of them. They became mine through every fever I nursed alone, every nightmare I chased away, every milestone you missed because you chose your reputation over their existence." Albert flinched, as if she'd struck him, but pressed on with the stubborn determination that had made him billions. "I was wrong. I was terrified and selfish and completely wrong. But I'm here now, and I want to—" "You want to what?" Kessie interrupted, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and glanced toward the pediatric ward. These conversations belonged in hushed tones, away from sleeping children and curious nurses. You want to waltz back into their lives now that they're past the difficult baby years, now that they're old enough to be interesting, to reflect well on your image? That's not fair. Fair? She stared at him with genuine incredulity. Albert, you have no idea what fair looks like. Fair would have been choosing us when it mattered. Fair would have been being there when Isaiah cried for a daddy he'd never met. Fair would have been helping me figure out how to pay for Elijah's surgery when he was 3 years old and needed his tonsils removed. Each word hit him like a physical blow, and she found she didn't care. 7 years of swallowing her hurt, of explaining to her sons why they were different from other families, of carrying the weight of single parenthood while he lived in his glass tower, untouched by the consequences of his choices. I know I don't deserve a second chance, he said, his voice breaking on the admission. But please, let me be part of their lives. Let me try to make up for the time I lost. Lost? Kessie shook her head, bitter laughter escaping despite her best efforts to maintain composure. Albert, you didn't lose anything. You threw it away. There's a difference. She moved toward the vending machine, needing the simple ritual of selecting coffee to steady her hands and her resolve. But Albert followed, crowding into her space with the desperate energy of a man drowning. I made a mistake, he insisted, the biggest mistake of my life. But I'm here now, and I want to. You want. She spun to face him, coffee forgotten. It's always about what you want, isn't it? What you need, what you're ready for, what fits into your perfectly ordered world. Well, here's what I want, Albert. I want my sons to never doubt that they're loved. I want them to never settle for less than they deserve. And I want them to never have to wonder if the people who claim to love them will disappear the moment things get complicated. I wouldn't disappear again. You already did. Her voice was steady now, carrying the weight of 7 years' worth of accumulated wisdom. You disappeared the night you chose fear over love. You disappeared when you decided our family was a problem to be managed rather than a blessing to be cherished. Albert was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him processing her words with the same analytical precision he applied to business deals and merger agreements. But this wasn't a negotiation. This was a reckoning. What can I do? He asked finally, and the question carried genuine desperation. Tell me what I can do to earn the right to know them. Kessie looked at this man who'd once held her heart, who'd whispered promises about forever before deciding she wasn't worth the complications forever might bring. 7 years had given her clarity about love, real love, the kind that showed up consistently and without conditions. You couldn't even be part of mine when it mattered, she said, her voice soft but implacable. Now you want the reward without the responsibility? I want the chance to take responsibility now. For what? 2 7-year-old boys who've never needed you, who've grown up strong and kind and brilliant without any help from you. She shook her head, suddenly exhausted by the conversation and the emotions it was dredging up. Albert, they don't need you. They never did. I made sure of that. The words were cruel but necessary, a boundary drawn in blood and maintained through years of deliberate choice. Her sons would never long for something they couldn't have, would never define their worth by someone else's capacity to love them. Maybe I need them, he said quietly, and for a moment she glimpsed the lonely man she'd once loved beneath the billionaire's armor. That's not their job, she replied, gentler now but no less firm. Children aren't responsible for healing their parents' wounds or filling their empty spaces. They're supposed to be loved unconditionally, not used as emotional band-aids for grown-ups who made bad choices. Albert was quiet for so long, she thought the conversation was over. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I loved you. I want you to know that at least. I loved you more than I'd ever loved anyone. The confession hung between them like smoke from a fire that had burned out long ago. Kessie felt the familiar ache of old hurt, but also something newer, the hard-won peace of a woman who'd learned that love without action was just pretty words. "I know you did," she said, and meant it. "But love isn't enough, Albert. It never was. Love is just the beginning. What matters is what you choose to do with it." She walked away then, leaving him standing alone under the harsh fluorescent lights, finally understanding that some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. Some chances, once lost, never came again. Behind her, she could hear him call her name one more time, but she didn't turn around. She had learned the difference between love and commitment, between wanting and choosing, between regret and redemption. Some lessons took 7 years to fully understand, but once learned, they became the foundation for every choice that followed, including the choice to protect her children from the kind of love that came with conditions, that disappeared when tested, that prioritized comfort over commitment. Her sons deserved better. They always had. And she would spend the rest of her life making sure they never settled for less. Chapter 6. Second rejection, her apartment door. The doorbell rang at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon, when the world should have been painted in weekend contentment, but instead carried the weight of unwelcome intrusions into carefully constructed peace. Kessie was helping Isaiah with his science fair project on the kitchen table, a volcano that would erupt with perfectly timed chemical reactions, while Elijah curled on the living room couch, reading about ancient Egypt with the intense focus he brought to everything that captured his imagination. The apartment hummed with the quiet satisfaction of a family that had learned to find joy in simple moments, in each other's presence, in the rhythm of life, lived deliberately and with love. When the doorbell interrupted their Saturday serenity, Kessie assumed it was Zuri bringing another plate of homemade cookies, or perhaps the mail carrier with a package requiring signature. She certainly didn't expect to find Albert Thaddeus Bradford standing in her hallway, looking like wealth and regret, in a perfectly tailored charcoal coat, his arms full of offerings that felt more like apologies than gifts. White roses. 24 of them, their petals perfect and cold as fresh snow. Kessie's favorites from their time together, a detail he'd somehow retained through 7 years of separation, though she couldn't decide if the gesture was thoughtful or manipulative. Educational toys filled his other arm, not random expensive purchases designed to impress, but carefully chosen items that spoke to intimate knowledge of her son's interests. A microscope set for Isaiah's scientific curiosity, art supplies for Elijah's creative soul, building blocks that would challenge minds like his own, analytical, methodical, always seeking to understand how pieces fit together. "What are you doing here?" she asked, not moving from the doorway, not inviting him into the sanctuary she'd spent 7 years building. "I brought these for the boys," he said, and his voice carried none of the commanding authority she remembered. I hoped." He looked past her, into the apartment, taking in the modest but loving space she'd created. Family photos covered every available surface, the boys at various ages, milestones celebrated, memories preserved. Their artwork decorated the refrigerator and living room walls like a gallery of childhood wonder. Books everywhere, evidence of minds encouraged to grow and question and dream. It was a home built on love rather than money, on presence rather than presence, on the kind of daily devotion that turned a small apartment into something more valuable than all his penthouses combined. "Albert, you can't just show up here," she said, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "This is our home, our safe space." "I know," he replied quickly. "I know I should have called first, but I was afraid you wouldn't see me if I asked." "You were right to be afraid." The words hit him like physical blows, and she watched his carefully controlled composure crack slightly. This wasn't the boardroom where his word was law, or the charity galas where his presence commanded automatic deference. This was her territory, where she made the rules and enforced the boundaries necessary to protect her children. "Mama, who's at the door?" Isaiah called from the kitchen, his voice carrying natural curiosity tinged with protective instincts that broke her heart and made her proud simultaneously. "Just someone selling something," she called back, never taking her eyes off Albert's face. "Keep working on your volcano." Albert flinched at the dismissal, understanding that in this moment he was nothing more than an unwelcome salesman peddling products nobody wanted. "Please," he said quietly. "Just 5 minutes. Let me explain." "Explain what?" Cassie stepped into the hallway, pulling the door partially closed behind her. Her sons didn't need to witness this conversation or absorb the complicated emotions it stirred. "Explain why you decided 7 years too late that maybe you made a mistake. Explain why you think expensive gifts can erase the damage you did." "I'm not trying to erase anything," he insisted. "I'm trying to build something new, for them, for us." "There is no us, Albert. I thought I made that clear at the hospital." But he pressed on with the stubborn determination that had made him billions, as if her resistance was simply another obstacle to overcome through persistence and superior resources. "I've been thinking about what you said," he continued, setting the gifts down in the hallway like offerings at an altar. "About responsibility and choices and what love really means. You were right about everything. I usually am. I want to do better. I want to be better. I know I can't undo the past, but I can help build their future." Cassie stared at him, this man who'd once held her heart and then dropped it like something inconvenient, something that didn't fit into his carefully ordered world. 7 years had given her clarity about his character, brilliant but cowardly, generous with money but stingy with vulnerability, capable of great love but only when it came without risk. "Build what future?" she asked. "Albert, they already have a future, a beautiful one, filled with people who chose to love them from the beginning, people who didn't need to be convinced they were worth staying for." "I know," he said, and she heard desperation creeping into his voice. "But I could help. College funds, opportunities, experiences I could provide." "Stop." The word came out sharper than intended, but she was tired of his assumption that everything could be fixed with money. "Do you hear yourself? Even now you're talking about what you can provide, what you can give them, not who you could be to them, not how you could love them, just what your bank account can offer." Albert ran both hands through his hair, the gesture she remembered from their intimate moments when he'd struggled to articulate feelings that threatened his control. "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it?" She studied his face, seeing the familiar pattern of a man who thought problems could be solved through strategic applications of wealth and influence. "Albert, love isn't a business transaction. You can't buy your way into their hearts or negotiate yourself into their lives." "Then tell me how," he pleaded. "Tell me what I need to do." The question hung between them like a challenge, and Cassie felt the familiar exhaustion that came from trying to explain emotional truths to someone who viewed relationships as puzzles to be solved rather than gardens to be tended. "You want to know what you need to do?" she asked quietly. "You need to understand that you already had your chance. 7 years ago, when it mattered most, when they needed you to choose them over your fears, you failed, and some failures don't get do-overs. Everyone deserves a second chance." "No," she said firmly. "Everyone deserves to be chosen the first time. My sons deserved a father who wanted them from the moment they existed, not one who showed up when it became convenient." Albert was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him processing her words with the same analytical precision he brought to merger agreements and acquisition deals. But this wasn't a business negotiation. This was about hearts and trust and the kind of love that couldn't be bought or bargained for. "What if I'd been different 7 years ago?" he asked finally. "What if I'd chosen differently?" Then we'd be having a different conversation, she replied honestly. But we can't live in what-ifs, Albert. We have to live in what is. And what is that my sons have never needed you. They've grown up strong and kind and brilliant without you. They're not missing pieces waiting to be completed by your presence. The truth of those words settled between them like a weight. Elijah and Isaiah were whole children, complete in themselves, raised by a mother who'd made sure they never felt less than because of an absent father. I need them, he said quietly, and she recognized the admission for what it was, not love, but loneliness seeking to be filled. That's not their job, she replied, gentler now but no less firm. Children aren't responsible for healing their parents' regrets or filling their empty spaces. Then what about you? The question came out raw, unguarded. Do you need anything? Could we? No. The word was final, absolute. Whatever we had died 7 years ago when you chose fear over love. I'm not interested in resurrecting something that was never strong enough to survive the first real test. She reached for the door handle, ready to end this conversation and return to the peace of her Saturday afternoon with her sons. But Albert's voice stopped her. I loved you, he said desperately. I still love you. Kessie turned back to face him, studying the man who'd shaped her understanding of love's limitations and her own strength. No, Albert, she said sadly. You loved the idea of me. The way I made you feel about yourself, the way I fit into your life when it was convenient. But you never loved me enough to fight for us when it got difficult. I was scared, I know. But love isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and choosing to stay anyway. It's about protecting what matters, even when it costs you something. She opened her door wider, preparing to step back into her life. The real one she'd built through choice and sacrifice and unwavering commitment. My sons already have everything they need, she said, her voice carrying 7 years of accumulated wisdom. They have a mother who chose them from the moment they existed, a grandmother who helps raise them with patience and wisdom, neighbors who love them like family, and their own unshakable bond with each other. Albert stood in her hallway surrounded by expensive gifts that suddenly looked pathetic and inadequate, offerings from a man who'd never understood that love wasn't about what you could provide, but about who you chose to be. They already have a future, Albert, she continued, her hand on the door. You just weren't in it. She closed the door slowly, not angrily, just finally, not slamming it like a weapon, but settling it into place like a boundary that had taken 7 years to fully establish. Through the door, she could hear him standing there for several more minutes, probably staring at the barrier between him and the life he'd chosen to abandon. Eventually his footsteps retreated down the hallway, carrying him back to his world of calculated generosity and emotional distance. Inside, Isaiah looked up from his volcano project with the perceptive intelligence that sometimes made her forget he was only 7. Was that man sad, Mama? He asked quietly. Yes, baby, she replied, settling back into her chair beside him. But some sadness is earned, some consequences are choices, and we're not responsible for fixing other people's regrets. Even if we could help. Kessie considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Her sons were learning about kindness and compassion, but they also needed to understand that love had boundaries, that helping didn't always mean rescuing. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is let people live with the consequences of their choices, she said carefully. It's how they learn to make better ones next time. Isaiah nodded with 7-year-old gravity, then returned to his volcano, secure in the knowledge that his world remained stable and his family remained whole. Outside, the afternoon continued its gentle progression toward evening, unmarked by the drama that had briefly threatened their peace. Some storms passed without causing damage, leaving the carefully tended garden of their life exactly as it had been, protected, nurtured, and complete without anyone's permission or validation. The gifts Albert had left in the hallway would be gone by tomorrow, removed by building maintenance. But the love that filled their small apartment would remain, built not on grand gestures or expensive offerings, but on the daily choice to show up, stay present, and love without conditions or time limits. Some doors, once closed, stayed that way for excellent reasons, and some families were already exactly as they were meant to be. Chapter 7. Third Rejection at School Art Day. The gymnasium of Riverside Elementary School buzzed with the controlled chaos of proud parents admiring their children's artistic achievements, but Albert Bradford stood frozen before a simple watercolor painting that felt like staring directly into his own soul. Isaiah's artwork hung at child height on the far wall, part of the second-grade display celebrating family and community. The painting was titled "My Family" in careful 7-year-old lettering, each letter painstakingly formed with the concentration only children brought to work that mattered to them. The composition was simple but devastating in its completeness. Kessie stood in the center, painted in vibrant blues and purples that somehow captured the essence of her nursing scrubs and the warmth of her smile. Isaiah had positioned himself on her left, grinning widely with paint-splattered hands raised in celebration. Elijah occupied her right side, quieter but equally content, holding what appeared to be a book. Behind them, painted in warm golden tones, stood an elderly woman Albert recognized as Amina, the grandmother who'd helped raise his sons, who'd been present for every milestone he'd missed. The love between the four figures was evident in every brushstroke, in the way Isaiah had painted their hands touching, their faces turned toward each other with obvious affection. There was space in the painting, intentional white space where other families might have fathers or additional relatives. But it wasn't empty space, wasn't a gap waiting to be filled. It was simply space that belonged to other things. A rainbow Isaiah had painted arcing over their heads, flowers scattered at their feet, a sun that beamed down on this complete, self-contained unit of love. Albert had been standing before this painting for 20 minutes, having arrived at Riverside Elementary's family art night uninvited and unannounced. He'd learned about the event through the kind of careful research that had built his business empire. A few strategic phone calls, a donation to the school's art program that bought him access to their newsletter, the persistent investigation of a man desperate to glimpse the lives he'd abandoned. The event was scheduled for 6 to 8 p.m. on a Thursday evening, designed to accommodate working parents who wanted to celebrate their children's creativity. Albert had arrived early, parking across the street and watching families stream into the building, mothers still in work clothes, fathers carrying tired toddlers, grandparents with cameras ready to document every moment. He'd waited until the gymnasium was crowded enough that his presence might go unnoticed, then slipped inside like a ghost, haunting the periphery of life he'd chosen not to live. For the past 20 minutes, he'd wandered through displays of childhood imagination made manifest, finger paintings that captured pure joy, clay sculptures that defied physics but embraced possibility, collages that turned magazine clippings into windows to young souls. But it was Isaiah's painting that stopped him. That made him understand with devastating clarity exactly what he'd lost. "Mama, you're here!" Isaiah's voice carried across the gymnasium, bright with excitement and relief. Albert turned to see Kessie entering the building, still in her hospital scrubs from the day shift, her natural hair pulled back in the practical style he remembered from their early days together. She looked tired but radiant, the way she always had when focused on something that mattered, and her sons always mattered most. Elijah appeared at her side immediately, taking her hand with the quiet contentment of a child who knew his anchor had arrived. Isaiah bounced toward them, practically vibrating with excitement as he began dragging them toward his displayed artwork. I painted our family, he announced proudly. Mrs. Rodriguez said it was the most beautiful family she'd ever seen in a painting. Albert stepped back into the crowd, trying to become invisible as he watched his sons, their sons, share this moment of pride with the woman who'd earned every ounce of their love and devotion. He saw Kessie's face transform as she took in Isaiah's painting, saw her eyes well with tears that she quickly blinked away before her son could notice. "It's perfect, baby," she whispered, kneeling to Isaiah's eye level. "Absolutely perfect. You captured all of us just right." "I made Grandma Amina taller because she always says she's shrinking," Isaiah explained seriously. "And I made you the biggest because you're the most important person in the whole world." "What about us?" Elijah asked, with mock offense that made all three of them laugh. "You're important too," Isaiah conceded. "But Mama's the boss." Albert watched this exchange from 15 feet away, hidden among other families, but feeling more alone than he'd ever felt in his life. This was intimacy, real intimacy, not the manufactured closeness of expensive dates or carefully orchestrated romance, but the natural rhythm of people who'd chosen each other daily for 7 years. Other parents began approaching Kessie, greeting her with the warmth reserved for community members who'd earned their place through consistent presence. Albert recognized some of them, other single mothers she'd probably connected with, married couples who'd invited his sons to playdates he'd never supervised, teachers who spoke to her with the respect given to parents who showed up reliably for their children. "Ms. Monroe, Isaiah's artistic talent is really exceptional," said a woman Albert assumed was Mrs. Rodriguez, based on Isaiah's earlier comment. "Have you considered enrolling him in the after-school art program?" "We've talked about it," Kessie replied, her arm automatically encircling Isaiah's shoulders. "But between work schedules and Elijah's soccer practice, it's challenging to coordinate transportation." "I could help with rides," offered another parent, a woman with kind eyes and paint-stained fingers. "My daughter's in the program too, and they live in your direction." This was community. This was the village that helped raise children when fathers were absent and mothers worked multiple jobs to provide everything their families needed. Albert had spent 7 years in boardrooms and charity galas, surrounded by people who wanted things from him. Meanwhile, Kessie had built something infinitely more valuable, genuine relationships based on mutual support and shared commitment to their children's well-being. "Mr. Albert?" The small voice made him freeze. Elijah stood beside him, grey eyes curious and intelligent, studying Albert with the careful attention he brought to everything that interested him. "Hi," Albert managed, his voice catching slightly. Up close, Elijah looked even more like him, the same angular features, the same habit of tilting his head when thinking, the same storm-grey eyes that saw too much and analyzed everything. "You're the man from the hospital," Elijah observed, "the one who was looking at us." "Yes." Albert knelt to bring himself closer to Elijah's eye level, fighting the overwhelming urge to pull this child into his arms. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Much better. Mama says I'm stronger than my germs." Elijah paused, then asked with typical 7-year-old directness, "Why were you looking at us like that?" "Like you were sad." The question hit Albert like a physical blow. How did you explain to a child that you were sad because you'd thrown away the chance to know him? That you were staring because you were trying to memorize features that should have been familiar but remained foreign? "Sometimes adults look sad when they're thinking about mistakes they made," Albert said carefully. "What kind of mistakes?" "Big ones. The kind that hurt people you should have protected." Elijah nodded with 7-year-old gravity. "Mama says everyone makes mistakes, but the important thing is learning from them so you don't make the same ones again." "Your mama sounds very wise." "She is. She's the smartest person I know." Elijah studied Albert's face with disconcerting intensity. "Are you learning from your mistakes?" Before Albert could answer, Isaiah appeared with Kessie close behind, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm as she recognized Albert among the crowd of parents. "Elijah, come here, please," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that moved mountains and managed emergencies. But Isaiah, with typical 7-year-old curiosity, stepped closer to Albert instead of backing away. "I know you," he said, tilting his head in a gesture that mirrored his twin brother's analytical habit. "You're the sad man from the hospital. Why are you at our school?" Albert found himself looking into 2 sets of grey eyes that mirrored his own, seeing himself reflected in features that should have been familiar but felt like meeting strangers who shared his DNA. These children were brilliant and kind, and completely whole without him, exactly as Kessie had raised them to be. "I wanted to see your art," he said honestly. "I heard there was an exhibition and I wanted to see what you'd created." "Did you see my painting?" Isaiah asked proudly. "It's my family, Mama and Elijah and me and Grandma Amina." "I did see it," Albert replied, his voice thick with emotion he was struggling to contain. "It's beautiful. You're very talented." "Mrs. Rodriguez says I might be an artist when I grow up," Isaiah continued, unconscious of the emotional earthquake happening among the adults around him. "Or maybe a scientist like Elijah wants to be. Or maybe both. You can be anything you want to be," Albert said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "That's what Mama always tells us," Elijah added, moving closer to his brother with protective instincts that would have made Albert proud if he'd earned the right to such feelings. Kessie approached then, her expression carefully controlled, but her body language radiating protective tension. "Boys, why don't you show Mrs. Patterson your clay sculptures?" she suggested, indicating another teacher who was clearly prepared to redirect the twins' attention. "But we're talking to—" Isaiah began. "Now please," Kessie said, and her tone brooked no argument. The boys exchanged glances but obeyed, moving toward the clay display with the reluctant compliance of children who knew better than to push boundaries when their mother used that particular voice. Albert watched them go, memorizing the way they walked, the way Isaiah gesticulated while talking, the way Elijah listened with complete attention to everything his brother said. "You have no right to be here," Kessie said quietly once the boys were out of earshot. "I know," Albert replied. I needed to see them, to understand what they're like when they're not in a hospital bed." "They're like children whose mother loves them," she said coldly. "Children who've never doubted their worth or questioned whether they matter. Children who don't need anything from you." "I can see that." Albert looked toward where Isaiah was enthusiastically explaining his clay creation to a teacher who listened with genuine interest. "They're remarkable, Kessie, beautiful and smart and complete." "Yes, they are. You did that. You raised them to be confident and kind and—" He struggled for words that could encompass what he was witnessing. "You gave them everything they needed to become exactly who they're supposed to be." For a moment, Kessie's expression softened slightly. This was praise she deserved, recognition of the miracle she'd accomplished through 7 years of deliberate, consistent love. "I did what any mother would do," she said simply. "No," Albert shook his head. "You did what the best mothers do. You put them first, always. You made sure they felt valued and protected and loved unconditionally. You built their foundation so strong that nothing can shake it. And now you want to be part of what I built." It wasn't a question, and Albert heard the steel beneath her words, the protective fury of a mother guarding cubs she'd raised to be strong and free. "I want the chance to love them the way they deserve," he said desperately. "I want to learn who they are, what they dream about, what makes them laugh. I want to be someone they can count on." "They already have someone they can count on," Kessie replied firmly. "They have me. They have their grandmother. They have teachers who invest in their success and neighbors who care about their well-being. They have a community that chose them from the beginning. I know I can't replace any of that, Albert said quickly. I wouldn't want to, but maybe there's room for one more person who loves them. Kessie stared at him for a long moment, and Albert found himself holding his breath, hoping against hope that 7 years of absence might somehow be forgiven, that love could be retroactive, that families could be rebuilt from good intentions and desperate regret. "Albert," she said finally, her voice carrying the patient tone she might use to explain something to a child. "Love isn't a performance. You don't try fatherhood like a business pitch. You live it. Every single day you weren't there, I was. That's the difference." The words hit him like physical blows, each one precisely aimed at the heart of his self-deception. "Every fever I monitored alone," she continued relentlessly. "Every nightmare I chased away, every scraped knee I kissed better, every bedtime story I read, every homework session I supervised, every soccer game I cheered at, every parent-teacher conference I attended, every Christmas morning I made magical, every birthday I celebrated, every moment of their lives that mattered, I was there." Albert stood there, absorbing the litany of his absence, understanding finally that fatherhood wasn't about wanting or intending or promising. It was about showing up, day after day, year after year, through the mundane and the magnificent alike. "They don't even know me," he whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "No," Kessie agreed sadly, "they don't. But that's not their loss, Albert. That's yours." She moved past him toward where her sons waited, drawn by the magnetic pull of children who knew their mother would always come when they needed her. "But maybe," she added, pausing without turning around, "if you'd chosen differently 7 years ago, if you'd been brave enough to love us when it was difficult, they would know you. Maybe you would have been the father they deserved instead of a stranger studying their art like it might explain everything you missed." Albert watched her rejoin Isaiah and Elijah, saw their faces light up as she approached, witnessed the complete trust and adoration they reserved for the woman who'd never failed them. Some mistakes couldn't be undone. Some chances, once lost, never returned. Some love, no matter how desperate or sincere, came too late to matter. He left the gymnasium quietly, unnoticed by anyone except 2 7-year-old boys who would probably forget the sad man who'd talked to them briefly about mistakes and learning. But Albert would remember forever the painting that showed him what family really looked like, the children who were whole without him, and the woman who'd built something beautiful from the pieces he'd abandoned. Outside, the April evening was soft with spring promise, but Albert felt winter in his bones as he drove away from another life that would continue perfectly without him. Chapter 8. Fourth Rejection. In the Rain. The April rain fell like tears from a sky that understood heartbreak, turning the pharmacy parking lot into a mirror that reflected the fluorescent lights of businesses that stayed open late for people whose lives couldn't accommodate regular hours. Kessie emerged from Walgreens at 9:47 p.m., clutching a white paper bag containing Elijah's follow-up antibiotics and the children's vitamins that kept her boys healthy through the changing seasons. Her 12-hour shift at the hospital had ended at 7, but she'd stayed late to help train a new pediatric nurse, then stopped for groceries, then remembered the prescription that couldn't wait until morning. This was the rhythm of single motherhood, days that stretched into evenings that blended into nights, every moment scheduled around the needs of 2 growing boys and the job that provided for them. She was exhausted in the way that had become so familiar it felt like a natural state, but it was good exhaustion, earned through purpose and love and the satisfaction of building something meaningful. The rain soaked through her spring jacket within seconds, plastering her natural hair to her scalp and making her scrubs cling uncomfortably to her skin. She fumbled for her car keys while trying to protect the medicine bag from the downpour, cursing under her breath about weather forecasts that had promised clear skies. Kessie. Her name carried across the parking lot like a prayer or a plea, and she froze with her hand on the car door, water streaming down her face as she recognized the voice that had once whispered promises about forever. Albert Bradford stood 20 feet away, under a streetlight that cast harsh shadows across his aristocratic features. His expensive raincoat kept him relatively dry, but his perfectly styled hair was beginning to curl from the humidity, giving him a vulnerability that wealth couldn't armor against. "What are you doing here?" she asked, though part of her already knew. He'd been watching, waiting, learning her routines with the same methodical precision he brought to hostile takeovers and complex negotiations. "I followed you from the hospital," he admitted, and the honesty felt both refreshing and deeply unsettling. "I've been trying to find the right time, the right place to talk to you without causing a scene or upsetting the boys." "So you chose stalking instead?" Albert flinched at the word but didn't deny its accuracy. "I chose desperation," he corrected quietly. "I chose the behavior of a man who's running out of options and time." Kessie stared at him across the rain-soaked asphalt, taking in the changes that 2 weeks of sleepless nights had carved into his features. He looked haggard, older, like a man wrestling with demons that money couldn't exorcise. "Albert, I've told you." "I know what you've told me," he interrupted, moving closer despite the rain that was now falling in sheets. "I know I don't deserve consideration or forgiveness or even basic courtesy after what I did, but I can't stop thinking about them, about you, about what we could have been. What we could have been died 7 years ago when you chose fear over love." "I know," he said, and his voice broke on the admission. "I know I killed it. I know I destroyed something beautiful because I was too proud and too scared to fight for what mattered most." The rain continued its relentless assault, turning their conversation into something cinematic, but not romantic, just desperate and painful and years too late. Kessie could feel the cold seeping through her jacket, could think of her boys asleep at home under Amina's watchful care, could imagine the warm bath and cup of tea waiting for her if she could just get in her car and drive away from this conversation. But something in Albert's posture, the way he stood without trying to protect himself from the rain, as if he deserved whatever discomfort the night could provide, made her pause. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. "Really? What is it you think I can give you that you can't buy or negotiate or acquire through your usual methods?" "Forgiveness," he said immediately. "A chance to prove I'm not the same man who failed you 7 years ago. Permission to love my sons the way I should have from the beginning." "They're not your sons," Kessie replied, and watched him absorb the blow like a physical hit. "They're mine. I earned them through sleepless nights and worried days and a love that never wavered. You donated genetic material. That doesn't make you a father." "I know the difference now," Albert said desperately. "I've spent the last 2 weeks watching other families, studying what real fathers do, understanding what I threw away. I see it in the way that father at the school picked up his daughter when she fell. I see it in the way the man at the grocery store listened to his son's story about frogs with complete attention. I see it in every interaction I've witnessed between people who chose each other and kept choosing each other when things got difficult." Kessie felt something dangerous stirring in her chest. Not love, but a kind of exhausted pity for a man who'd finally understood what he'd lost when it was too late to matter. "And what exactly do you think that knowledge does for anyone?" she asked. "Understanding what you should have been doesn't change what you were. Recognizing good parenting doesn't make you a good parent. Watching other people love their children doesn't give you the right to love mine." "They are mine too," Albert said, and something in his voice, possession, entitlement, the assumption that blood-created claims, ignited fury in Kessie that she'd been carefully banking for weeks. "No," she said, her voice rising above the sound of rain hitting pavement. "They are mine. I made them mine through choice and sacrifice, and the kind of love that doesn't come with conditions. I made them mine by staying when you left, by choosing them when you rejected them, by building their foundation so strong that they never had to wonder if they were wanted. I want them now. Now, she repeated, bitter laughter escaping despite her best efforts to maintain composure. 7 years later, when they're past the difficult baby years, when they're old enough to be interesting, when they can reflect well on your image, now you want them. That's not why, isn't it? Kessie stepped closer, rain-soaked and furious and magnificent in her protective rage. Albert, be honest for once in this conversation. When you imagine having them in your life, what do you see? Baseball games where you look like Father of the Year, school events where people admire your involvement, photo opportunities that show the world how you've changed, how you've grown. I see loving them, he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. You see using them, she corrected ruthlessly, the same way you've used every relationship in your life, for what it can provide, for how it makes you look, for what it adds to your carefully curated image of success. Albert was quiet for a long moment, rain streaming down his face like tears he was too proud to shed openly. Maybe you're right, he said finally. Maybe I do see them as redemption for my mistakes, as proof that I can change, as absolution for the choice I made 7 years ago. But does that make my love for them less real? It makes it selfish, Kessie replied without hesitation. And my sons deserve better than to be someone's emotional rehabilitation project. I don't care what the world says, Albert continued as if she hadn't spoken. I don't care about my reputation or my board of directors or the complications it might create. I just want my family back. The words hung between them like weapons designed to wound, and Kessie felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, not toward forgiveness, but toward a kind of crystalline clarity about the man she'd once loved. My family, she repeated slowly. You really don't hear yourself, do you? After 7 years of absence, after rejecting us when we needed you most, after building a life that had no room for the inconvenience of children, you still think we're yours to claim. I made a mistake. You made a choice, Kessie interrupted, a deliberate, calculated choice to prioritize your comfort over our needs. And now, when it's convenient for you, when your guilt has finally outweighed your fear, you want to undo the consequences of that choice. Albert moved closer, desperation radiating from him like heat. Tell me what to do. Tell me how to fix this. I'll do anything, give anything, change anything. You had a family, Kessie said, her voice breaking on words that carried 7 years of accumulated pain. You had a woman who loved you completely and children who would have adored you from their first breath. You told that woman she wasn't worth your name. You told those children they were problems to be solved rather than blessings to be cherished. The rain continued to fall around them, but she was beyond caring about being soaked, beyond thinking about comfort or convenience. This conversation had been building for 7 years, and she would see it through to its inevitable conclusion. I stopped waiting for you a long time ago, she continued, each word deliberate and final. I stopped believing you might choose us. I stopped hoping you would realize what you'd thrown away. I built a life without you, Albert. A beautiful, complete, happy life that doesn't have room for your regret or your guilt or your sudden desire to play father. Kessie, no, she said firmly, moving toward her car with renewed purpose. This conversation is over. All of them are over. Stop following me. Stop showing up uninvited. Stop trying to insert yourself into a family that never needed you to be complete. She opened her car door, pausing only when Albert called her name one final time. I loved you, he said desperately. I still love you. That has to count for something. Kessie looked at him through the rain, this man who'd shaped her understanding of love's limitations and her own strength, and felt only the tired sadness that came with finally letting go of hope she'd stopped nurturing years ago. "Love without action is just pretty words," she replied quietly. "Love without commitment is just convenience. Love without courage is just selfishness dressed up in romantic language." She got in her car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. In her rearview mirror, she could see Albert standing alone in the parking lot, rain-soaked, and finally understanding that some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. At home, she found Amina reading on the couch, soft jazz playing from the kitchen radio. The boys were sleeping peacefully, their breathing synchronized in the way of twins who'd shared everything since conception. "How are they?" Kessie asked, kissing her mother's forehead. "Perfect angels as always," Amina replied, studying her daughter's rain-soaked appearance with knowing eyes. "And how was your evening?" "Educational," Kessie said simply, hanging up her wet jacket and heading toward the bathroom, where a hot shower waited to wash away the chill of confronting old ghosts. Some storms passed without causing lasting damage. Some conversations closed chapters that should have ended years ago. Some women discovered that the love they'd built after heartbreak was stronger than the love that had broken them in the first place. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments of ordinary magic with two boys who'd never doubted they were wanted. Tonight, she would sleep soundly in the knowledge that her family was exactly as it should be, complete, protected, and founded on love that came without conditions or expiration dates. Chapter 9. Legacy of Love. The morning Atlanta woke up to news of the pandemic, Aretha Whitmore was in her garden, teaching